Award-winning TV presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Peace be upon you and welcome to the News in Brief. The Palestinian chief negotiator Saeb Uraiqat gives his resignation letter to Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas. Now to our reporter in Ramallah, Majid Saeed.
The chief Palestinian negotiator, Dr. Saeb Uraiqat, informs President Yasser Arafat and Abu Mazen of his resignation from the government. Uraiqat refused to comment on this news. However, some Palestinian officials reported that his resignation was because Uraiqat, as the chief negotiator, was not going to be included in Abu Mazen's meeting with Sharon, which is scheduled to take place in the next 24 hours.
Lebanon discusses with the High Representative for European Common Foreign and Security Policy, Javier Solana, their reservations on the roadmap, especially since it does not include the Palestinians' right of return.
Meanwhile, here in Beirut, they anticipate that the roadmap will fail on both the Israeli and Palestinian sides.
6 Palestinian martyrs were killed by Israeli gunfire during ongoing incursions in Beit Hanun, parts of Jabalia, and Beit Lahia, north of the Gaza Strip. The United States of America presents a draft resolution to the Security Council, aiming at lifting the sanctions off Iraq, giving the UN a limited role, and ensuring that Washington and London will control the revenues of Iraqi oil. The German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder met with the U.S. Secretary of State and declared that Berlin and Washington agree on lifting the sanctions off Iraq as soon as possible. This is the end of the News in Brief. Peace be upon you and welcome to the news. The Palestinian Minister of Negotiations, Saeb Uraiqat, submitted his resignation to Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen. Uraiqat did not state the reasons behind his resignation, which comes only one day before the scheduled meeting between Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and Palestinian Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen. Meanwhile, the Palestinian President Yasser Arafat asked Saeb Uraiqat to withdraw his resignation. Saeb Uraiqat has not explained the reasons behind his sudden resignation from Mahmoud Abbas's cabinet, which is only several days old. The resignation was submitted one day before Abu Mazen's meeting with Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, noting that this is the highest-level meeting between Israelis and Palestinians in years. However, news from the Palestinian circle suggests that this meeting may be the reason behind Uraiqat's resignation, since Abu Mazen is excluding him from attending the meeting while inviting head of the Legislative Council, Ahmed Kuria, and the Minister of Internal Security, Mohammed Tahlan, to be members of his delegation. Saeb Uraiqat is the most notable Palestinian figure ever since the beginning of the negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Prior to his resignation, Uraiqat was the appointed Minister of Negotiations in Abu Mazen's cabinet. Before that, he was the Minister of Local Government. Uraiqat was born in Jerusalem 49 years ago. He is a member of Fatah and represents the city of Jericho in the Legislative Council. However, this is not the first time that Saeb Uraiqat is the center of a crisis in the Palestinian Authority. 4 years earlier, when the Palestinians and Israelis were negotiating at Wye River in the United States, Arafat was going to fire Uraiqat after a disagreement arose between them regarding some aspects of the negotiations, despite the fact that Uraiqat is a close ally to Arafat. If Saeb Uraiqat insists on his resignation, the negotiations between the Palestinians and Israelis, if resumed, will be lacking one of the most notable Palestinian figures, who has been there since the launching of negotiations in Madrid in 1991.
Ironically, Iraq, the country of oil, is suffering from an oil shortage. The oil industry is going through a great crisis. People got accustomed to seeing long lines of cars waiting in gas stations all day long. Also, the oil crisis is causing big social and economic problems in Iraq. Very long lines of cars can be seen near the gas stations in Baghdad. Who can believe this? People in Iraq do not have enough oil to fill their cars, although they live in a country that has the second largest oil reserve in the world. Ignoring the curfew, which lasted until 6 a.m., Haj Kadim went to the gas station at 3 a.m., hoping to fill his car with gas, but he had to wait 7 hours before he was able to do that.
I waited from 3 a.m. until 10 a.m. before I was able to fill my car with gas. I left my home at 3 a.m. and now it's 10 a.m. The gas that I have is not enough. This is not the only shortage we have. We have an electricity shortage as well. Everything is destroyed.
The long hours of waiting increase the anger of those waiting in the gas stations. Often verbal disputes end in physical confrontations. Last Tuesday, one man was killed at this site. The American forces supervise the gas stations from a distance. Often, they put barbed wire around the stations and spend their days playing with the children. Some of the cars run out of gas while waiting, forcing their owners to push their cars until they reach the gas pumps. People realize that they will run out of gas before arriving to the pumps if they leave the engines on.
We are forced to wait for a long time because there is an oil shortage. The Americans caused this shortage because they refused to supply gas stations with oil. There's no way for us to get gas, but to wait in these long lines.
Across from the gas station, gas is being sold in the street. Most of the sellers are children. Poverty forced them to take on this business, which was created by the oil crisis. However, some of the customers are American soldiers because they pay more money.
It is normal for me to sell gas. The Americans ran out of gas, so I sold it to them. They help us and we help them. This is a normal thing to do.
The Americans say that the oil shortage in Baghdad is caused by the lack of functional oil refineries in the city. However, the Iraqis tell a different story. The Iraqis say that the Americans have deliberately created the oil shortage and other crises to prevent people from dealing with more important issues, such as the future of the country. Al-Madar Program, Mohammed Rabi, Abu Dhabi Television, Baghdad.
Moscow said it was not ready to back the lifting of sanctions on Iraq unless Washington agrees to changes concerning the handover of power to an Iraqi government and control of Baghdad's oil. After talks with its Chinese counterpart, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Yuri Fedotov said on Friday that in its current form, the draft resolution requires serious changes. The Russian announcement, fully supported by China, appeared to pour cold water on U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell's hopes, voiced Friday that the UN Security Council would come to a quick agreement on lifting sanctions against Iraq. The draft resolution under discussion by the UN Security Council would lift sanctions imposed on Iraq in 1990 after its invasion of Kuwait, and would enable Washington and its allies to effectively run the country and control its oil revenues for at least a year. With billions of dollars in oil and debt interests in Iraq, Russia has been anxious to secure UN involvement in Iraq to prevent the US from taking full control of Baghdad's oil riches until it hands over power to an Iraqi administration. Moscow's position is broadly backed by France and China, fellow veto-wielding members of the UN Security Council that also opposed the US-led invasion. As Washington battled to win backing for a UN resolution scrapping sanctions, Iraq's Western administrators vowed on Friday to ban loyalists of Saddam Hussein's outlawed Ba'ath Party from public office. The US installed administration is to try to ban between 15,000 and 30,000 Ba'ath Party diehards from holding public service jobs through stringent screening. Senior officials from the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, the ORHA, said attempts at de-Ba'athification may, in the short term, hamper the country's recovery, but should be pursued. In an effort to restore order, Iraq's occupiers have reinstated much of the police force and asked government workers to restore public services. But top ministry officials have been ordered to sign a document denouncing the party that had ruled Iraq since 1968. Pro-American Iraqi politician Ahmed Jalabi has also called for de-Ba'athification, warning of violence if top officials were not held to account. US-led forces have detained about a third of the officials on a list of 55 most wanted Iraqis and are holding up to 7,500 prisoners of war. They have suggested that Iraqis set up their own special court to try those accused of crimes. A 60-strong team of Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) officers has arrived in Saudi Arabia amid a fresh terror warning, and US demands the kingdom step up efforts to combat terrorism after the Riyadh suicide bombings. US embassy officials in the Saudi capital said the team would be involved in the investigation into the bombings in coordination with the Saudi authorities. They added that the team's stay in the kingdom would be open-ended. The arrival of the FBI team coincided with a State Department warning that Washington had received an unconfirmed report that a possible terrorist attack in the Al-Hamra district of Jeddah may occur in the near future. On Thursday, a British police team also arrived in Saudi Arabia, while Australia announced it too was sending police officers to help with the investigation into Monday night's attacks on 3 expatriate residential compounds. The blasts, blamed on Saudi-born Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda terror network, left at least 25 dead, including 8 US citizens, along with 9 bombers and some 194 wounded. Following the attacks, the State Department ordered the departure of its non-essential diplomats from Saudi Arabia.
A large number of Israeli occupation troops backed by tanks and helicopters were still occupying and sweeping areas of the northern Gaza Strip Friday after raiding the area on Thursday and killing 5 Palestinians, including a boy. Another man was shot dead late Thursday south of Gaza. Around 70 tank and armored personnel carriers were operating inside Beit Hanun and parts of Jabalia town and Beit Lahia. At least 8 houses were demolished today as 10 bulldozers were razing Palestinian farmland. Several Palestinians were arrested as well. Israeli military commands say their forces would stay as long as it takes to prevent rocket attacks. They deployed on the roof of the houses and banned Palestinians from leaving their homes. In retaliation, members of the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades, the military wing of Hamas group, fired homemade Qassam rockets overnight at Stedrot settlement, 6 kilometers from the center of Beit Hanun. The group issued a statement Friday morning listing overnight rocket and mortar shelling at Beit Hanun and Nahal Oz checkpoints in Gaza. They also said they targeted Israeli tanks by detonating 5 bombs in Beit Hanun. Still in the Beit Hanun area, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade's military wing of Fatah said it destroyed an Israeli Merkava tank of the 3rd generation at the Zaytun area. The group said in a statement that an engineering military unit blew up a 100-kilogram bomb at an Israeli tank, injuring all those inside. For its part, the Al-Quds Brigades, the military wing of the Islamic Jihad, said it detonated a 50-kilogram bomb at a Merkava tank in Beit Hanun. Another group, the National Palestinian Resistance Brigades, the armed wing of the Democratic Front, said one of its groups detonated a bomb at an Israeli tank and said that it inflicted casualties. In Nablus, Israeli occupation forces blew up the home of Martyr Radwan Kroh of the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine in the West Bank. 8 Palestinians lived in the demolished house. Kroh had carried out an operation against an Israeli military base in the Jordan Valley last month, in which 2 Israeli occupation soldiers were killed and 9 others were injured. Meanwhile, Israeli police were put on high alert on Friday, banning all men under the age of 40 from attending Friday prayers in occupied Jerusalem. The ban was issued after the Islamic movement in Palestinian territories occupied since 1948 called on its supporters to protest there against the arrest of the movement's leader and 14 of its members on charges that they funneled millions of US dollars to Hamas. Muslims were further angered after reports that Israel's Internal Security Minister Dashi Hanegbi had promised Jews to pray soon at the Holy Aqsa Mosque compound, even without Muslim agreement. Jews claim that the Al-Aqsa Mosque sits atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple, and the Palestinians issued a stark warning that such a decision would only set the region further ablaze. Palestinian Negotiation Minister Saeb Ariqat said he handed in his resignation to Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas on Friday. Ariqat refused to give any explanation for the move, which came a day before a planned meeting between Abbas and Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. While Interior Security Minister Mohammed Dahlan and Parliamentary Speaker Ahmed Quraya were invited to join Abbas in his talks with Sharon, Ariqat was not. According to a senior Palestinian official who asked to remain anonymous, Ariqat may have resigned to express his displeasure at his exclusion from the talks before he was handed the newly created negotiations portfolio in the Abbas government sworn in last month. Ariqat was Minister of Local Government. Palestinian Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas said after a meeting with European Union Foreign Policy Chief Javier Solana that he will press for Israeli acceptance of the so-called roadmap to peace. Abbas, known as Abu Mazen, will try to persuade anti-roadmap Israeli Premier Ariel Sharon during the meeting on Saturday. After the meeting, Solana told Abbas that the EU will support the government of Palestine with all their capabilities. Both Israel and the United States have declared Palestinian Chairman Yasser Arafat persona non grata, calling for an alternative Palestinian leadership. Before meeting Abbas, Solana met Arafat but refused to meet any Israeli official after Sharon decided to boycott talks with the EU official.
Regarding the question about Sharon's visit, in principle we have no objection to meeting with the Israeli government, considering it is the government of our neighboring country, which has been elected by the Israeli population, and with which we have to deal and negotiate. As for the other point, we will primarily discuss the roadmap to peace, to which Israel is still objecting. We hope that our talks with Sharon will be positive, regardless of what is being said in the press.
Thousands of Palestinian refugees took to the streets of refugee camps, vowing to return to their villages and towns that are now part of the 1948 founded Israeli state. Many Palestinians from Haifa, Jaffa and other areas still have the keys of their houses they were expelled from. Every year, old and young people mark the Nakba or Catastrophe Day, pledging to continue on the path of Intifada.
Palestinian refugees marked the Nakba or catastrophe, the day Israelis occupied their land to establish Israel in 1948. After 55 years of Israel's continuous atrocities, Palestinians who were expelled from their homes then never gave up on their land or their right to return to their homes. At a time when the Israelis are more and more clinging to take this right from them, Palestinians say no one has the right to do that.
The right of return of Palestinians is a sacred right. It's not negotiable, nor apt to accreditation. This is the natural and humanitarian right of every Palestinian refugee individually. No one has the right to act freely on this issue. Besides, the right was accredited by the National Palestinian Assembly and the National Unanimous Program. No individual has the right to proceed independently.
Insisting on this right and refusing any attempt to undermine it, masses of Palestinians took to the streets holding banners of the names of villages and cities they were expelled from. Many started voicing out the names of the villages like Al-Lud, Al-Ramla, Akka and many others now part of Israel. Nothing is like one's home, says this woman. Here, they live in container-like houses and areas became to be known refugee camps.
I always have this dream that one day we will return to our land, whatever the price we're going to pay, whatever the sacrifices, the pain, the hardship that one would face.
Many of those may not live to see that day. One way to make this dream come true for them is to tell their children the story. Maybe one day they would return to the land of their grandfathers.
When I wake up every morning, I pinpoint to my children where our hometown Bir Ma'in is. When asked at school where he's from, my son always says, I'm from Bir Ma'in, but I live in the West Bank.
No one can eliminate the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their home.
And Palestinians say no one can stop the intifada against the Israeli occupation either, the only option to make this dream come true.
Russian President Vladimir Putin called on his nation to fire up the domestic economy and vowed that his security forces would prevail in the breakaway Republic of Chechnya. Speaking at his annual State of the Nation address, Putin devoted much of this year's address to the domestic economy. Calling the economic growth in the country modest and unstable, the Russian president said gross domestic product should double within the next decade. Putin said the current economic conditions, where 1/4 of the population lives below the poverty line, were unacceptable. The situation in Chechnya, where a Russian military occupation of over 3 years has failed to quash a separatist guerrilla movement, had a large share in Putin's speech. The president vowed that his forces would prevail in establishing Russian rule and order. In Germany, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell said he hoped Washington could win support within days for a new draft resolution to lift sanctions against Iraq that would allow the Arab country to resume oil sales. Powell was addressing a joint news conference in Berlin with German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer after earlier talks with Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. Schröder offered guarded support for ending sanctions, but gave no indication that Germany would back the new resolution. Fischer added that Germany wanted the UN to play a major role in Iraq's post-war reconstruction and said he was hopeful for an agreement. After criticism of an initial draft by some Security Council members, Washington submitted a revised resolution yesterday that slightly enhances the role of a UN envoy. However, the draft still gives wide-ranging powers to a US-led administration to control Iraq and its oil wealth that has raised hackles in Paris and Moscow. Earlier, Powell failed to win Russian support for the U.S. proposals to end the sanctions.
And I believe with the cooperation that I have seen expressed here today, as well as the kind of cooperation we're having with other members of the Security Council, it should be possible to come to closure quickly over the next several days or week on a UN resolution that will lift sanctions and put in place the authorities necessary for us to begin helping the Iraqi people in a more direct way, ensuring that international members or members of the international community have an opportunity to participate in our work as we go forward, and that the UN will have a vital role to play, as President Bush has said he believes the UN should play.
U.S. administrators vowed to ban loyalists of Saddam Hussein's outlawed Ba'ath Party from public office. Paul Bremer said he would shortly issue orders to remove Ba'ath officials who have crept back into power and eradicate their ideology from Iraq, a demand advocated by other Iraqi parties. Between 15 to 30,000 Ba'ath Party diehards might be prevented from holding public service jobs. Up to 700 of Iraq's 26 million people were full Ba'ath Party members. Many more were registered as supporters. At the same time, Iraqi families have continued to search through piles of bones at a vast mass grave, looking for their loved ones who are among up to 15,000 people reported missing in the area during Saddam Hussein's rule. More than 4,000 bodies have been found so far. Since Saddam Hussein's fall, mass graves have been unearthed in Najaf, Basra, Babylon, and other areas, and more continue to be found. The human rights group Amnesty International has said it has information about 17,000 disappearances in Iraq over the past 20 years, but that the actual figure may be higher. In a sign that life in Iraq is getting back to normal, Iraqi football is being given a new lease of life. Crowds packed the Al-Zara Athletic Club to watch Al-Zara and Police Academy soccer clubs play each other in the first major sporting event since the war. Football fans made the most of the game, which saw the police club beat Al-Zara 1-0 as they looked forward to many more matches. Iraq is due to return to the Arab Federation of Football and have been invited to the championships in Saudi Arabia in August.
In the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful, hello and thanks for joining us for this edition of Gender News, coming to you live from Tehran. On the last leg of his four-nation regional tour, Iranian President Mohammad Khatami arrived in the Bahraini capital city of Manama on Friday night and was accorded a warm welcome by the King of Bahrain, Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, and Prime Minister Khalifa bin Salman Al Khalifa. In his remarks, the visiting Iranian president pinpointed the need for regional states' cooperation to reach a sustainable security, stressing solidarity and mutual respect among the regional states to attain security. President Khatami said everybody should take a lesson from the regional tensions and dilemmas over the past 2 decades. The president also expressed hope for coming into power of a broad-based rule in Iraq and reiterated, in addition to reducing the problems facing the Iraqi nation, such a government would establish friendly ties with the Iranian neighboring states. The King of Bahrain, meanwhile, brought up the need for establishing sustainable security and emphasized Iran-Bahrain cooperation will give a boost to unity and confidence for mutual cooperation. During his stay in Bahrain, the Iranian high-ranking delegation is slated to meet with senior Bahraini officials as well as Iranians residing in that country. The Iranian president will wrap up his four-nation tour of Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain Saturday evening. Iranian Foreign Ministry condemns U.S. officials' recent interfering remarks concerning Iran. Foreign Ministry spokesman Hamid Reza Safi on Friday announced that statements recently made by U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and White House National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice are in contradiction with political terms and fail to be compatible with those claiming to be politicians. Mr. Safi also said making repeated accusations does not justify such unfounded allegations. He then asserted Iran is completely serious and firm in its campaign against terrorism, adding the country's nuclear programs are absolutely transparent and peaceful. Foreign Ministry spokesman also noted U.S. double standards and its support for terrorism do not give the right to Washington to pass judgments about their other states and nations. Rumsfeld has claimed that a number of al-Qaeda leaders reside in Iran, and Rice has described Iran's weapons programs as worrying.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation,